The lesser-known candidate is presented by the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA, a law firm representing the disabled in Social Security and VA compensation claims. If you need an attorney to assist you with a Social Security or VA compensation claim, call the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA at 1-800-875-8064 or send an email to info@ssalawyers.com. And now, back to the lesser-known candidate. In order to obtain delegates to the National Convention, a candidate has to do more than pay a filing fee or get petition signatures. The candidate must certify in writing to the state Democratic chair the name of their authorized representative, and each candidate must show that they use their best efforts to ensure their delegation within the state delegation achieves the affirmative action and inclusion goals of the party and is equally divided between men and women. In October, Rocky, Miguel, David, Lisa, and Kathy met to discuss recruiting Democrats who would be willing to serve as delegates and act as an authorized representative for the state. David pointed out that in 2012, a perennial candidate, John Wolf, got 41.63% of the vote in Arkansas against President Obama and 12% of the vote in Louisiana. The party announced that he failed to comply with the delegate selection plan because he missed deadlines to certify and authorize a representative for his campaign in the state. Since the ultimate goal was to get delegates at the convention, Rocky did not want to lose before he even got started. Lisa Cohen had a plan to help Rocky. She had pro-Israel registered Democrats in each state that were not enamored with the president and were willing to help. Kathy Martinez, on the other hand, was conflicted. She did not want to hurt the Dela Grandes, but her loyalty was to the president. She decided not to say anything about this meeting to Brian Greenberg. She was confident it would not make a difference in the ultimate outcome. David reiterated to Rocky how difficult it was to obtain ballot access in South Carolina. A candidate must file his statement of candidacy and pay a fee of $20,000. The party got to decide who was a bona fide Democrat and whether the candidate was generally acknowledged and recognized in the news media throughout the United States as a viable candidate for that office, and are actively campaigning for the South Carolina Democratic presidential primary, voted in their own state's most recent Democratic presidential primary, and were taking demonstrable steps to qualify for the delegate selection process in at least 12 states. Since this was the nation's first primary, Rocky really wanted to try and get on the ballot for this election. Although the president would definitely win South Carolina by a large percentage, Rocky figured he'd be the only challenger, and if he could get 15% of the vote, he would get his delegates and maybe pick up a few in some other states. Going through the list of states, Virginia came up. To get on the Virginia primary ballot, a presidential candidate needed 5,000 signatures, including 200 from each congressional district, who attested that they intended to participate in the Democratic primary. "This is crazy," said Rocky. "It will cost $50,000 to get the signatures. They're basically shutting everyone out of the primary except major candidates, and since no major candidate will run against an incumbent president, should we even try to get on the ballot in Virginia?" "Well," said David, "you got the matching funds. You might as well use them. I wouldn't spend the money on ads. No one is going to vote for you because of TV ads. They're going to vote against the president as a protest vote. Since there will be other lesser-known candidates on the ballot in states where ballot access is easy, I recommend that you try to get on the ballot in Virginia." Lisa Cohen agreed. She thought to herself that while getting a few $1,000s from pro-Israel Democrats was not difficult, she wasn't going to be able to help with the petition requirements. Rocky would simply have to pay a company to get those signatures. After the meeting, David and Rocky had a private conversation. "It looks like you have a shot at getting at least some media attention. We really need to work on the issues and how you want to respond. You can go way to the left like Bernie Sanders and pick up votes from people who think the president is too conservative, or you can go to the right and get votes from those who think he's too liberal. On the other hand, you can be ambiguous and not take a position and let everyone imagine your position. I recommend you remain ambiguous. For instance, if they ask you for your position on abortion, you could say that the right of women to make their own reproductive health decisions is extremely important to you, but at the same time, you would like to see the overall number of abortions be dramatically reduced. If they ask you about healthcare, you could respond, "We live in the greatest country in the world, and there's no good reason for any American to not have access to affordable, quality healthcare. What we have done in the past hasn't seemed to have worked out. Maybe because these things are being run by politicians who are out of touch and haven't worked or run a business in the private sector. I am offering a new way to do things, a way where the government agencies are run efficiently and are accountable. We can offer better healthcare at a more affordable price if we think like a regular person and not like a politician. Here's what I wrote about education, David said. You can say, America is falling behind in educating our youth. We can do better. We are the richest country in the world, yet many students do not get the science, math, and language skills and education they need to succeed. I will make education of our youth one of my top priorities. You get the idea, David said. Just talk in platitudes, not specifics. Don't let anyone pin you down. If they ask you for yes or no, don't answer yes or no, but instead give a speech about what you want to talk about. Also, please remember to memorize the names of the government heads of the major countries and review world geography. Rocky figured that the most important countries and leaders to remember were members of the G20. The G20 was founded in 1999 in response to several global economic crises. It was made up of most of the world's largest economies and accounted for about 80% of the world's gross domestic product. He was having a hard time memorizing all the countries in the G20. He recalled that David Bernstein had come up with an acronym that assisted him in remembering the members of the president's cabinet. Rocky decided that he was going to try to do something similar with the countries that were members of the G20. He wrote down the names of all the countries first. Then he wrote down the first letter of each country. It was sort of like playing Scrabble, but with 20 tiles. The first word he came up with was just. This was from the first letters of the countries Japan, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. The next word he found using the remaining letters was came. This was from the first letters of the countries China, Australia, Mexico, and European Union, which was not really a country, but still part of the G20. The next two words were hard to come up with. He had 3 eyes left. Then he saw it. Rabbis. Russia, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Italy, and South Africa. Yes, I know, he thought to himself. Rabbi is spelled with 2 B's and not 2 I's, but what the hell? It is still something I can remember. So far, he had rabbis just came. He had 6 letters to go. He then quickly found the last word. He would use the first 2 letters in the country India to spell the 7-letter word fucking. France, United Kingdom, Canada, South Korea, but he would just use the K in Korea, India, and Germany. He now had his mnemonic device. Rabbis just came fucking. Russia, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Italy, Canada, Argentina, Mexico, European Union, France, United States, China, South Korea, India, and Germany. Of course, if anyone asked him how he remembered the names of all the countries in the G20, he wasn't going to tell them. This would be his secret unless some code breaker figured it out. Rocky had also tried to come up with a mnemonic device to remember the names of the leaders of each of the countries in the G20. After spending about an hour trying to do this, he gave up. Instead, he made flashcards with the name of the country on one side and the name of the leader on the other side. Anytime he had to travel, he would practice in the car or on the plane. If he couldn't look at the cards, he would go in the order of the mnemonic device for the countries. Russia, Putin. Argentina, Fernandez. Brazil, Lula da Silva. Indonesia, Widodo. Italy, Moroni. Saudi Arabia, Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. After he memorized the leaders for rabbis, he proceeded to the next 4. Japan, Kishida. United Kingdom, Sunak. South Africa, Ramaphosa. Turkey, Erdogan. Next was the 4 for the mnemonic hint came. Canada, Trudeau. Australia, Albanese. Mexico, Lopez Obrador. European Union, Michel and von der Leyen. This was getting hard. Rocky would repeat the first 6, then repeat the first 10, and then repeat the first 14 until he was comfortable with the first 14. He then proceeded to the last 6. France, Macron. United States, Anderson. China, Xi Jinping. South Korea, Yoon. India, Modi, and Germany, Scholz. After several weeks of practice, Rocky had finally memorized the names of the leaders of the G20 countries, at least their last names. He would try to remember their first names, but that wasn't a priority. China and South Korea were a little tricky, because in those countries they used their last name first, so Xi is the last name of the leader in China, and his first name is Jinping. Rocky was hopeful that these leaders would stay in power, at least until after the election, because he didn't want to try to memorize any more names. By December 1st, Rocky had submitted his paperwork to the chairs of all of the Democratic organizations in every state, territory, and for Washington, D.C. Only one state, South Carolina, refused to submit his name for inclusion on the ballot. The party chair advised that although Rocky had met almost all the criteria for ballot placement, it was decided he was not recognized by the national media as a viable presidential candidate, therefore he did not meet the criteria for ballot placement. David and Rocky discussed suing the South Carolina Democratic Party. In the end, they decided this would be futile. The primary was in February, and even if election cases were advanced on the court's docket, by the time the decision would be made, the ballots would have already been printed. David requested that the party return the $20,000 Rocky had paid, but the party refused. David advised Rocky that later they could at least sue the Democratic Party of South Carolina for a refund of the filing fee. Because Rocky had secured ballot placement in every state, territory, and in Washington, D.C. except South Carolina, a few reporters from various news organizations did call Rocky to interview him and wrote articles about the campaign. The website had about 4,000 visitors. Rocky's campaign was not getting a lot of attention. Despite the vote of the Democratic National Committee to hold the first presidential primary in South Carolina, by state law, New Hampshire required itself to hold the first presidential primary in the nation. Although the date of the presidential preference primary in New Hampshire is set by state law, and the Democratic Party of New Hampshire had no control over the scheduling of the primary, nonetheless, the Democratic Party decided that if a state jumps the line in scheduling its primary, the Democratic Party of that state would not be able to seat all of its delegates. Furthermore, any candidate who campaigns in New Hampshire could face additional penalties, including being denied some delegates. The state of New Hampshire determined its presidential preference primary would be held on Tuesday, January 30th, 2024, 3 days before the South Carolina primary. In response, the Democratic National Committee decided that it would strip New Hampshire of one half of its delegates, and if any candidate campaigns New Hampshire, including placing his or her name on the ballot, that candidate would be awarded no delegates from New Hampshire. The party decided not to disallow participation in party-sanctioned debates, as this could possibly be problematic down the road if, God forbid, something happened to the president and other Democratic candidates campaigning in New Hampshire. This could mean no Democratic debates would be held, which could significantly hurt the party's eventual nominee. Rocky vacillated whether he would campaign in New Hampshire. On one hand, if the president was not on the ballot, he might be able to get enough votes to raise his profile. However, even if he achieved the 15% threshold to be awarded delegates, he would be disqualified from receiving delegates for campaigning in New Hampshire. Rocky decided that the benefit of being on the ballot in New Hampshire outweighed the potential penalty of not being eligible for delegates from New Hampshire. There was one other important factor Rocky considered. Every 4 years, St. Anselm's College conducted a lesser-known candidates debate. At this forum, candidates who were not invited to participate in a party-sanctioned debates were given the opportunity to be heard. The forum was held on Saturday, January 27, 2024, and hosted by the New Hampshire Institute of Politics and televised on C-SPAN 2. The event began with the moderator, Neil Levesque, welcoming the audience. Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all to this very special primary event. We have a very special guest here tonight, the man who has protected New Hampshire's position as the state to hold the first in the nation's primary. Please give a warm round of applause to the Secretary of State, Bill Gardner. Following some polite hand clapping, Bill Gardner assumed his position at the microphone and began. Every 4 years, this is a special night in New Hampshire, and it's a reflection of the primary and what it's all about. The New Hampshire primary from the beginning has been about the little guy. It gives an opportunity for any person who meets the qualifications to be able to have a chance to run for president, to get on the ballot here, and we have had several instances over the years where someone came into this state, was very little known, and ended up winning the New Hampshire primary and ended up becoming president. I will now introduce the person who will moderate this debate, Josh McAlvin. Josh McAlvin swapped places with Secretary Gardner. Thank you, Secretary Gardner. It is an honor to be introduced by a man I respect so much. Okay, let's get to know our candidates. Let's start with Coach Bobby Welch from Tennessee. Next, we have Stuart Marcus from New York, Kelly Lord from Arizona, Rocky Della Grande from New Jersey, Brock Hutton, also from New York, Donald Edwards, who hails from Wisconsin, and finally, Tom Sloman from Connecticut. These are lesser-known candidates, but that does not diminish their willingness to serve. Let me introduce our panelists who will be asking questions. We will start with Holly Raymer, one of the most respected journalists in the state of New Hampshire. She's been with the Associated Press for 27 years and has covered presidential campaigns and has asked a lot of questions and is always fair. Next to her is John DeStacio. He's a longtime journalist in New Hampshire and a political reporter from WMUR. So let's give a welcome to the panelists as well. Each candidate will be given a 2-minute opportunity for an opening statement. The questions themselves will require a 1-minute response. So let's get right to the opening statements. We will start at the far end and go right to left with Coach Bobby Welch. Seated at the table, a muscular white male appearing in his mid to late 40s with a clean-shaven head began his remarks. Hi, I am Bobby Welch and I am seeking the Democratic nomination for president in 2024 and I am from Nashville, Tennessee. It's great to be here in New Hampshire. You know we face a pivotal time in our country. We must decide which direction our country is heading. And let's face it, the president doesn't have the toughness to win re-election. We need someone who has the stamina to go all 4 quarters, and I can do this. You deserve a president who can orchestrate a full-court press against Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. You deserve a president that knows something about teamwork and has a plan to unify this country. I've put together basketball teams with white players, black players, Spanish players, gay and straight, all types of religions, conservative and liberal. None of that mattered. What mattered is could they pass, shoot, dribble, rebound, block, and dunk. Some were guards, some were forwards, and some were centers. Not everyone was on the starting 5, but everyone was prepared to play, and they all had one common bond, and that was to win for their school and for their fans. But make no mistake, one great player does not win a championship. It takes a team playing together. Again, my name is Coach Bobby Welch. The next candidate was Stuart Marcus. I'm Stuart Marcus and I'm a disruptor, he began. I'm running to stir things up. How many of you think Congress and the president are doing a good job? He asked the audience. How many of you think that our politicians in Washington are bought and paid for by special interests? He asked. Well, there's a way to dramatically change things, and that is to vote for a lesser-known candidate. It's not going to hurt the president if one of us gets 1 or 2% of the primary votes, but think about the impact it would have if one of us got 2 or 3% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary. Think about how it would mix things up. Stuart the Disruptor is my website. I've got a bunch of videos and I'd love to have you watch them. Stuart Marcus was followed by Kelly Lord. Kelly Lord was a 69-year-old divorce attorney from Scottsdale, Arizona. She looked somewhat younger than her age. She wore a purple pantsuit and a white ruffled shirt. This election is about whether we are going to be at war or peace. The next president is going to decide whether the middle class is going to decline and whether the poor are going to completely go under or rise up. I have a plan to deal with these things. I have a plan on how to deal with our tax structure. I would not tax people who make less than $36,000 a year. I would change the cap on Social Security. I would get rid of the cap altogether. By making these changes, we could make a huge difference in the tax revenues in America. I would also like to change the way we handle veterans' health care. I would have a vet care card for all veterans, and we would try to make sure they got the same care as everyone else in the country. Rocky Delagrande was up next. He was used to doing television commercials, but this was his first time talking to a national audience. He knew he only had 2 minutes. He wanted to say as much as he could, but also speak clearly and slow enough so he sounded confident and knowledgeable. Gentlemen, he began. In the audience, there was murmuring about the fact he did not say ladies and gentlemen. The other candidates here have a lot of good ideas, but have no chance of getting elected. I am the only one up here who is on the ballot in every state and territory except South Carolina. I've raised over $100,000 in campaign contributions from hundreds of people all over the country. Most of the contributions were for $250 or less. I have qualified for federal matching funds. I have a successful business with over 100 employees. I know how to manage, I know how to budget, and I know how to negotiate. I am fully bilingual and have traveled the world extensively. Lastly, although I don't have the experience as an elected official, as does the president, I have experience in the private sector that he doesn't have. And by the way, do you want someone with experience running up a debt of over $30 trillion? Or someone with experience balancing a budget, making a profit, and expanding his business? I'm Rocky Delagrande, and I would appreciate your vote. Rocky finished just under the 2-minute mark. He thought he did okay, but wasn't sure if he came across as too braggadocious. Rocky was followed by Donald Edwards. Mr. Edwards was a tall white male with a ruddy complexion. Unlike the other male candidates who dressed in suits and ties, he wore a red sweater and dress slacks. He had been rolling his eyes and smirking while the other candidates were talking. Now it was his turn. "Look at a small child on Christmas morning," he said. "All people who have ever lived want two things: happiness and healing. The first step is for all of us to treat everyone with love, forgiveness, mercy, tolerance, kindness, respect, dignity, friendliness, chivalry, courtesy, and old-fashioned manners. As we move toward Easter, look at the thief on the cross. Is a guy who has never had one moment of happiness, but in the last second, he saw the goodness in Christ and he said, 'I'm sorry for what I did. That was wrong. I want to love others. I want to make a difference in this world.' He will be remembered down through the ages. So our job is to help people, to love people, to encourage people, and to bring the message of Christmas to as many people as possible." The other candidates just looked at each other as if to say, "What the hell is he talking about?" Brock Hutton was due to speak next. "How do I follow that?" he thought. He then proceeded to give his opening remarks. "Imagine you go to the store and you buy a bunch of things," he began. "Then you go home and give the bill to your kids and tell them they have to pay for the stuff for the rest of their lives. You wouldn't do that to your children, and the country shouldn't do it either. We have a national debt of more than $32 trillion. We continue to operate with a huge deficit. I have a plan to fix the problem. Excluding Social Security and Medicare, which I would not cut, I would cut all other federal spending by 10%. That would reduce the deficit by $250 billion. I would raise the Medicare tax from 1.45% to 2%, which would raise another $80 billion, and I would impose a national entertainment tax. Finally, I would push for a constitutional amendment to limit a member of the House of Representatives to 4 terms and a senator to 2 terms. The last candidate to speak was Tom Sloman. Tom Sloman was a professional poker player. This was his 3rd time running for president and his 3rd lesser-known candidate debate. He gave opening remarks similar to his remarks in the previous debates. "My name is Tom Sloman, and I am one of the top-ranked professional poker players in the world. I have written 10 books on how to win at poker, and just about everyone in the professional poker world knows who I am. I keep hearing everyone talk about universal health insurance, but as far as I'm concerned, this is communism. Healthcare for all is unworkable. We have to have a system where people can go out and buy insurance if they want, or they can be like me. I don't have health insurance. All those left-wing ideas are too far out. If the people who support Medicare for all win, it will be a catastrophe." The rest of the forum consisted of questions and answers involving such topics as gun control, immigration, campaign finance reform, criminal justice reform, and trade policy. Some of the answers were thoughtful and cogent, while others were bizarre and illogical. Overall, Rocky felt that the moderators were mocking the lesser-known candidates, and the debate was simply an opportunity for the media and the public to laugh at the people who thought they had a chance to be president or make a difference in the political landscape. On February 3rd, the South Carolina primary was held. As the president was the only candidate on the ballot, he received 100% of the vote and all of the pledged delegates. Nevada had just switched from caucuses to primaries. The new Nevada statute did not provide for a filing fee or petition signatures, or even that the candidate must be nationally recognized as a viable candidate. As a result, there were 135 candidates on the Nevada Democratic presidential primary ballot. Rocky and Miguel hired a driver to drive the campaign RV with the banners on the side up and down the streets of Las Vegas for 2 weeks prior to the election. On February 6th, the president received 98% of the vote, with the remaining votes dispersed among the other 134 candidates. New Hampshire also held its primary on February 6th. The filing fee for the primary in New Hampshire was $1,000, and 35 Democratic candidates were on the New Hampshire ballot. The president easily won the primary as a write-in candidate with 84% of the vote. Surprisingly, a parity candidate, Vermin Supreme, received 15% of the vote. A group of college Democrats and young Democrats had been exchanging posts on Facebook about how funny it would be to vote for Vermin Supreme. Vermin Supreme filed to run as a write-in candidate and submitted proposed delegates following the rules of the Democratic Party to be awarded delegates if he attained the threshold. He did not campaign in New Hampshire, nor did he pay the filing fee to get on the ballot, but he still got enough write-in votes to qualify for a handful of pledged delegates. Rocky only received 26 votes in the New Hampshire primary, even though he ran commercials on WMUR in New Hampshire and traveled extensively throughout the state. Rocky and his team did not expect to do well in the first 3 primaries, but the results were worse than they anticipated. They hoped for better results in Georgia on February 13th, where the president and Rocky were the only candidates on the ballot for the Democratic presidential primary. In the Georgia primary, Rocky got 8% of the vote, the best so far, but not enough to entitle him to delegates. The next primary in February was scheduled for the 27th in Michigan. The president and Rocky, again, were the only candidates to qualify for the Michigan Democratic presidential primary election. The Della Grande team met on the 15th to discuss the strategy for Michigan. Rocky had made a decision. He would spend all of the money in the campaign account advertising on TV for the Michigan primary. If he didn't get 15% of the vote, he would close down the campaign and go home. He wasn't going to withdraw from the remaining primaries, he just wouldn't campaign. Rocky had done a number of TV commercials for his dealership. He was comfortable in front of the camera, had a commercial producer and a crew with whom he worked, and could put together a professional-looking commercial quickly. Rocky and Miguel had put together several scripts. The first one read, "The president is the head of the executive branch and is in charge of all government agencies such as IRS, Social Security, and Veterans Affairs. Are you happy with the service you're getting from these agencies? Do you get put on hold for an hour waiting for someone to answer? Does it seem to take years to receive a decision on a claim or appeal? Is there seemingly no accountability? If you want to change the way government agencies are run, vote for Rocky Della Grande in the Democratic primary. I'm Rocky Della Grande and I approve this message." The second script was as follows. "Are you tired of high taxes? Rocky will slash your tax rates. Last year, if your tax rates were 32%, Rocky will cut them to 29.99%. That could be a savings of thousands of dollars. But if you want this, you have to act now. This deal will not last long. Voting will be over on February 27th. But wait, there's more. Elect Rocky and he'll increase your Social Security check by 5%. So get up and vote now. Vote Rocky Della Grande for president. I'm Rocky Della Grande and I approve this message." David suggested that they go with the second commercial. "I don't know," said Rocky. "It makes me look like a fool. It's fine for car sales, but it's not very presidential." "You overestimate the intelligence of the American public, Rocky," David replied. "The second one is going to get their attention and create a sense of urgency. The public likes funny commercials. Look at insurance commercials. Insurance is a boring product, so when they advertise their company, they have to use humor to get people's attention." "All right," agreed Rocky. "We'll go with the second one." After the TV ads ran in Michigan, the commercial went viral. It was uploaded to YouTube, shared on Facebook, and talked about on late-night TV. The commercials paid dividends. Rocky received 17% of the vote in Michigan, and he was awarded delegates to the Democratic National Convention. Rocky got what he wanted. He was out of campaign money and wasn't going to spend any more of his own money on the campaign. After the Michigan primary, Rocky told Lisa Cohen and Kathy Martinez that he appreciated the hard work, but he was closing the campaign office and there was no more money with which to pay salaries. Kathy returned to New York and Lisa Cohen went home to Potomac, Maryland. Kathy was looking forward to finishing school by the end of the year and starting her job at the White House the following January. Lisa Cohen decided to take some time off. She was tired of working for the Holocaust Museum. She wanted to try something different. Rocky and Miguel decided to refocus on running the dealership. Sales took a dip while they were on the road campaigning. Perhaps it was the economy and not linked to their absence, but they felt their presence made the employees more motivated. On February 29th, Kathy received a call from Brian Greenberg. He said he'd like for her to come to Washington to talk about her new position. Kathy had classes that she would have to miss if she left for D.C. She asked Brian Greenberg if they could meet on a weekend, but he insisted that it was important that they meet as soon as possible. Kathy took the Amtrak train from Penn Station to Union Station in Washington, D.C. She agreed to meet Brian Greenberg at the Old Ebbitt Grill on 15th Street. Kathy arrived a little after 1 p.m. Brian was waiting for her at a booth toward the back of the restaurant. He suggested the Maryland crab cakes. Kathy agreed to try the crab cakes. She was very impressed with the taste. It was almost all crab meat and hardly any filler or breading. Kathy opted for a wine, a Sauvignon Blanc, Twin Islands, produced in Marlborough, New Zealand. Brian ordered a locally brewed beer called DC Brow Pale Ale. Brian told Kathy that the reason he wanted to meet with her is to stress that her association with the Della Grande campaign could not be connected to him. If it comes up, it had to be her idea, and that once the campaign let her go, she applied for the White House job, and she was selected based on her grades, the prestige of New York University, and the fact that she was bilingual. Brian asked Kathy if she would like a tour of the White House. Kathy excitedly said yes. Brian walked with Kathy to the White House gate, a short distance from the Old Ebbitt Grill. He spoke with the security officer, and the two were escorted to a private entrance to the West Wing lobby. A guide, Shakira Jefferson, walked with Brian and Kathy to an area called the West Colonnade. This is where the president walks from the residence across the colonnade to the Oval Office, the guide explained. Shakira then pointed at the Rose Garden behind them. She told Kathy that this is where the president gives important press conferences. Shakira Jefferson, Brian, and Kathy next walked to the White House press briefing room. She informed Kathy that the press briefing room was formerly a swimming pool used by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as part of his physical therapy. The three proceeded to the cabinet room. This is where the president meets with the heads of administrative agencies of the government and the vice president. The group is referred to as the cabinet, informed Mrs. Jefferson. The guide led them to the Roosevelt room, formerly known as the fish room. At one time it was decorated with pictures of fish and stuffed fish and even had an aquarium. Today it had pictures of both Theodore Roosevelt, who had the West Wing built, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had it renovated. Finally, they arrived at the Oval Office. Kathy stood in awe. She was standing in front of the president's desk. Just then, a group of Secret Service persons entered the room, followed by the president, who was accompanied by his chief of staff. The president stopped and said hello to Brian Greenberg. He then looked at Kathy. "Who do we have here?" he asked. "This is Kathy Martinez," responded Brian. "She is a senior at NYU and will start working here next year, shortly after you are re-elected." The president asked Kathy if she would like to take a picture with him. He motioned for her to give him her cell phone, which she did, and he gave it to a Secret Service agent and asked him to take a picture. As Kathy stood next to him, the president put his hand on her back and started to rub her. She felt extremely uncomfortable. She couldn't tell him to stop in front of all those people. She felt helpless and humiliated, but tried to smile as if nothing was going on. Posing for the picture took only about 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. She was wondering whether she even wanted to work at the White House after this incident. How many other young women did he do this to? Technically, she was not sexually assaulted, but she definitely felt sexualized. She did not tell him to stop and wasn't his employee, at least not yet. Nonetheless, she felt violated. It was the job she always dreamed of, but was it worth it? She had to give it a lot of thought. On Saturday, March 2nd, the president retired to his residence after a late state dinner. He was exhausted after working 10 straight 16-hour days. He had a terrible stomachache. He figured it was from the steak he ate for dinner. He had been trying to avoid red meat, and this was the first time he had eaten beef in a while. This was most likely what was upsetting his stomach, he thought. The president got undressed, brushed his teeth, put on his pajamas, and went to bed. He was alone as the First Lady was visiting her mother in California. Although he was alone in the room, several Secret Service men were stationed outside of his bedroom. About 3 a.m., the president began experiencing sudden, severe abdominal pain. He yelled for the Secret Service men to come. Several Secret Service men entered the room, and the president asked them to call the doctor on staff and Walter Reed Hospital. Within 15 minutes, the president was on his way to the hospital. By the time the president got to the hospital, he was in critical condition. It was determined that he had suffered from an abdominal aortic aneurysm which had dissected, and he had developed internal bleeding. Emergency surgery was performed. Statistically, the post-operative mortality for an already ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm was higher than 40%. Unfortunately for the president, he was one of the unlucky ones. The president was declared dead at 6 a.m. of a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. The vice president was awakened and called to the hospital. The president's wife was notified, and she immediately got on a plane and headed to Washington. The press had to be notified as well. The public would wake up to the shocking news. Rocky had decided to sleep in that Sunday morning. He had been traveling quite a bit the previous few months and needed some rest. He put his telephone on silent. At 8 a.m., his wife, who had been up cooking breakfast, ran upstairs to awaken him. "Something is happening on our street," she said. "There are TV trucks lining the road and hundreds of reporters outside." Rocky got dressed and went to the front door and looked out the peephole. There were a throng of people on his front lawn, many with cameras. Rocky called the police to find out what was going on. The receptionist with the police department informed him that she would send someone out right away. She then said, "You must be the guy who'd been running against the president." "Yes," Rocky said. "Up until now, I've been pretty much ignored. What's going on?" he asked. "You don't know?" asked the receptionist. "The president died this morning." Rocky sank into a chair. "Oh my God," he thought, "that's terrible. But why are all these reporters out here? I had nothing to do with this." Just then, David Bernstein called. "Rocky," he said, "hang tight. They're sending the Secret Service over to protect you. Stay in a windowless room in the house and don't open any doors." Rocky was confused. "What's going on?" he asked David. "Rocky," David said, "you are the only candidate, at least the only living candidate, on the ballot for most of the remaining states in the presidential primary. By my account, by default, you will only be a few delegates short of winning the primary outright on the first ballot, assuming all of your pledged delegates vote for you. You just need a few party leaders or elected officials to vote for you to put you over the top. That's why everyone is out there." Rocky was not prepared for this. He took his wife into the den, closed the door, and explained everything to her. About 30 minutes later, the police arrived along with the Secret Service. The reporters and camera crew were removed from the property. They then sat down with Rocky and his wife to go over what they needed to do in order to be safe as a major candidate for president. Vice President Cameron Graham had been sworn in by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at noon on Sunday. For now, there would be a vacancy for vice president, but the new president pledged to fill the position as soon as possible. Because the Senate was almost evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, to ensure that his replacement would be promptly confirmed, he decided to select a retired senator who had no interest in re-entering politics. He would then be free to select a running mate of his choice when he sought the nomination at the convention. Now, President Graham presumed that the Democratic National Committee would suspend its rules, given the course of events, nullify the results of the primaries to date, and open the primaries remaining to allow new candidates to be placed on the ballot. Ilana Wasserberger, chair of the Democratic National Committee, called an emergency meeting of the Rules and Bylaws Committee. On March 5th, the Super Tuesday elections were conducted. Only the name of the deceased president and Rocky's name were on the ballot for most of the states. The turnout was low. Rocky received between 86% and 92% of the vote in each primary, with the deceased president receiving between 8 and 14%. Most of the votes for the deceased president were from absentee ballots and early voting. However, a significant number of people voted for the former president, even though he wasn't even alive. On March 12th, the Rules and Bylaws Committee of the Democratic National Committee met. In order to amend a state plan, the amendment would have to be approved by all state, national, and state party entities at least 35 days before the effective date. This would mean that even if the state party, the state, and national party all agreed to a change in the presidential primary process for a particular state immediately, the earliest date this would go in effect would be April 16th, and there was no way this was going to happen. The best they could come up with was an amendment which would allow pledged delegates to become unpledged at the convention. In other words, the delegates who pledged support for Rocky and became delegates by virtue of his winning a primary could change their mind and vote for whomever they wished. The committee was hopeful that the delegates would put their country first and nominate a competent and experienced candidate, such as the current president or a senator. The current president was confident he would win the nomination. The party would contact the delegates pledged to Rocky and convince them to support his candidacy. He would offer Rocky a cabinet position such as Secretary of Department of Agriculture or Transportation if he agreed to drop out of the race. On May 5th, it was reported that several young activists had been executed in Saudi Arabia. As a result, tens of thousands of Saudis took to the streets in protest. This resulted in 63 protesters being killed by Saudi police. Later that month, the protests had been growing larger. The larger the protests, the harsher the response was by the monarchy. A full-fledged uprising broke out on July 15th, primarily between the country's Shia population, who were backed by Iran, and the supporters of the monarchy. The rebels were able to destroy a large part of the power grid in Riyadh, using Iranian-manufactured drones similar to the ones used by Russia in Ukraine. The Saudis responded against rebel strongholds, bombing both military and civilian targets. Russia sent air defense systems to Iran, which in turn supplied them to the rebels, and at one point it appeared that the monarchy was in peril of being overthrown and replaced by a theocracy similar to the government in Iran. The monarchy refused to ask Israel for help, as this would result in the Arab and Muslim world turning against the monarchy. The Crown Prince asked the United States for advanced airplanes and air defense systems. At first, the United States declined, until it appeared that the Iranian-backed rebels would control the Saudi oil fields, giving them control of a huge percentage of the world's oil reserves. The President and Congress authorized the sale of the advanced weapons requested. This resulted in a virtual stalemate, with the death toll on each side rapidly rising. Not only did the fighting result in the death of thousands of civilians as a result of bombs and missiles, there was also widespread disease and hunger and lack of doctors, hospitals, and medicine. The Saudi economy was in a tailspin and gas prices had risen to $5 per gallon. The president urged increased oil exploration and drilling in the United States, including the use of fracking and drilling in the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Florida, which until the crisis had been off the table, especially from the Democratic Party side. By July, polls showed that only 32% of the United States population supported the president's actions in Saudi Arabia. Most Americans felt the monarchy was no better or worse than the rebels, and the United States should have stayed out of this fight. The environmental wing of the Democratic Party was furious at the president. Several ultra-liberal Democratic senators began putting out feelers whether to challenge the president at the Democratic National Conference for the nomination. The lesser-known candidate is presented by the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA, a law firm representing the disabled in Social Security and VA compensation claims. If you need an attorney to assist you with a Social Security or VA compensation claim, call the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA at 1-800-875-8064 or send an email to info@ssalawyers.com. And now, back to the lesser-known candidate.